All right, welcome back to Glitch Cube. We are a gaming podcast, and each week we take a deeper look into the art of video games. I'm Christian.
I'm Chris.
And welcome back, you guys, everybody, to another fun and exciting episode as we dive deeper into the world of horror. Last week, we talked a lot about atmospheric horror games, such as Alien Isolation, as being one of the penultimates as to what the franchise can do and how it has evolved over the years. But this time, we want to focus a little bit more on the opposite side of atmospheric horror, which would be action-oriented horror, where the control is completely in the player's hands, and they are able to take down the big bad, sometimes with ease, or at least a little bit less edge on it, right? Where it's less you trying to figure out how to just deal with this thing and more of, hey, am I strong enough to brute strength this guy and just keep cruising through the stage? And there are a lot of very interesting examples, and this franchise or this genre has evolved quite a bit throughout the years, where it was incredibly popular, very good, and then it kind of went a little goofy, right? It went to that whole kind of like last action hero style where it's just a little too much, and then now we're starting to see it come back to its roots and actually be very exciting, interesting, and just compelling once again, and I'm very excited for that. And we do have a pretty good example of what a strong action horror game is, and one that might surprise people, which we will be talking about later on in this episode, which I think it's really going to kind of surprise you. There are some obvious picks out there, but we didn't go with the obvious pick. We went with one that was a lot more, I would say, interesting and might have been missed by a lot of gamers out there. Definitely worth checking out. So stick around till a little bit later in the episode when we get into that one. But before we get too far, why don't we just jump into some more of the history of action-oriented horror games, kind of where they came from, where they're going, some of the weird areas in which that they've kind of branched into, because there's a lot of different subsets into this genre. It's kind of a wide net, I would say, right? Where it's not just your running guns. There's a lot of like cooperation now involved with it, because that's a lot. It's becoming more popular, I would say, as far as game development goes. So why don't you take it away, Chris, and let us know about the world of action horror games.
Well, it all kind of started with Resident Evil 4. I mean, most people know that if they are into like horror games, they know that 4 kind of like pushed the envelope on, instead of being afraid of your surroundings and afraid of your enemy, you can take them on. But seeing like the games, like horror games that came out not long after that, all tried to copy it, right? And, some were good. You look at like Dead Space, who took that formula and just moved it into space, which, I mean, it's genius.
And who's not afraid of space, right?
Yeah, right? Final Frontier.
Oh,
and the whole 360 PS3 era is when we really saw this more action-focused gameplay and everything. Honestly, you look at other genres like RPGs, all of it, they all had to have this either action style gameplay or shooter gameplay because they were big. It was the new thing that people could make look cool, and most of the time they were fun. I know there was a lot of garbage during this era, but there were quite a few gems. And when we look at, to me, some that really stood out in that era was Condemned. I actually played a little bit recently of the first one. And I thought it was interesting because it still has that kind of atmospheric, like, ooh, I'm in this abandoned building, like, what's going to rush out at me? And it being more melee focused, I enjoyed it because I don't like playing shooters with a controller. So just using melee, I was like, oh, this is fun. I don't feel like I have potato aim. Like, I can actually play this.
Right.
And it was cool. It's not like there's scary monsters or anything. It's just the atmosphere was kind of freaky. And then you had simple fighting.
And it made you it forced you to be up close and personal with the people you're fighting and attacking. So you can't just like stand in the back and kind of pick people off and then go through the stage, right? Like you had to actually be up there and encounter everything. So yeah, it definitely added to a more like intense environment.
Yeah. And I mean, another one that really stood out to me was Fear.
Oh, that's a crazy game. Ugh.
I remember seeing the cover for those games when they were out, and I was like, whoa, like, what are these? Like, these look freaky. And I mean, they were really out there. And I feel like it's a series you hear no one talk about anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yet I feel like, 10 years ago, people usually brought that franchise up when it came to like action horror, like a lot.
Yeah, I feel it was
And
like Fear and like Jericho around that time. Do you remember Jericho?
Oh yeah, Jericho.
Yeah, that was a great one. I remember playing a lot of Jericho, and
I forgot about that.
I remember dumping so much time in that, and that definitely was like, I think like at the peak of the over action oriented horror games, because that one is just straight, just fucking gun everything down. Like there is like you're getting like chased by hordes of enemies, you have crazy stuff around you, and you just blast through everything that's in your way. So yeah, that was a fun one. I like that one a lot.
And it's interesting because you look at like those three titles and you're like, oh wow, like this is actually pretty good. Like it's an interesting change. And another game that saw this kind of like horror action revival or evolution was Doom 3, which I remember when it came out, and I used to see like magazine ads where I'm like, whoa, this doesn't look like your typical Doom. Like this is different. And, it's basically you running through dark corridors with your little flashlight. And I mean, I didn't really realize this till recently, but the flashlight was really interesting and kind of innovative for the time. Carmack kind of wanted to do something different with the flashlight where you actually like, it acts like a real flashlight. Like in a lot of old games, the light's just this like straight beam that just shines on the normal object as if it's not really real. But this flashlight kind of reflected and did other more natural things, and it was interesting. Like being able to take a shooter and make it spooky was cool. And I mean, I feel like Doom 3 got an okay response from people, even though it was different. But I feel like with these last few games, that action horror was actually cool, because that way people who were too afraid of playing horror games in the past, because they felt weak, they were able to play these games and, feel like a boss, and then, but of course there's downsides to this style of gameplay, right? One of the big things during this console generation of the 360 was that cover shooters were big, right? Oh, yeah. Gears of War, I don't think Binary Domain. It was a Bulletstorm, like a bunch of different games in that time all had the same system. You duck behind cover, shoot, duck, and rinse, repeat every few maps.
Yep.
We started seeing that in horror games. You look at Resident Evil 5, you look at 6, and when they took that more action focused gameplay, it really took away from the scariness of it. It basically just became a zombie version of Gears of War, right, in my opinion, when you look at it. And
yeah, there's no more like fear in it. It's just because you're
just a shooter in a weird environment.
Like even with the character models themselves, everyone was just like badass, right? Like everyone, like you have your Chris Redfield, who's just like a tank of a man running through everything. So you automatically feel more powerful with that. Whereas like you miss the old days, right? Where like Resident Evil 1 and 2, like you might be playing as maybe like, Leon or whatever it may be, or even Fort, where like you're kind of a smaller character. So you might not feel as strong as you do when you play like your Gears of War guys or whatnot, where you just look like a fucking tank walking through this horde of enemies. So.
And it's interesting because, you look at the two big horror franchises and they both went down that route. Silent Hill did it differently with, I think Downpour was the one that was really like, I don't want to say it was like a Diablo kind of thing, but it had that action RPG kind of like look to it, but there were no RPG elements, but it had that style, and it was so different, horror games basically became, let's make it action in a kind of scary setting, which when you're powerful like that, it's not really scary in my opinion.
No, not at all.
Yeah, the setting looks cool, but am I going to get scared? No. And it's interesting because I feel like for a while during that time, a lot of people kind of didn't really focus on horror games anymore in the old sense, right? They became all action orientated, and then we saw a different evolution in the sense that like multiplayer, right? You know, Left 4 Dead. I mean, it was big. It wasn't really scary, you know. It was in a setting where, oh, this is, you know, zombie apocalypse, and for a long time that's all it was. There was zombie games when it came to horror.
There's like jump scares in those games, but it's not like actual like horror games where like you remember these villains or bosses like late at night, right? Like it's it's more fun because of the pacing of it. But yeah, like they kept jump scares in because they needed to stay established as like a horror game, but it just wasn't the same. It didn't feel like a classic horror game.
Yeah, you know, it's basically, am I going to get overrun? You know, and that was the fear. Like, I remember playing Dead Island with a friend. Like, we played the whole campaign together, co-op. And it was interesting. I mean, I thought the melee, the combat system in it was fantastic. But do I remember anything about it? Was it memorable in any kind of scary sense? No. But a lot of these games that were doing the co-op style to it kind of took away all of the fear of a horror game and just made it like, well, just shoot some zombies, you know. And we did see a lot of franchises, I don't want to say born from this style, but I mean, you look at Dead Rising, you look at State of Decay, like all of these games kind of came from that era and did something different. Like Dead Rising had a really cool idea, but I mean, I just couldn't really get into them because I hated the time frame.
Yeah, no. They were fun, but it's not like long-term fun, I would say.
Yeah. But, you know, you look at like horror multiplayer now, like Phasmophobia and stuff like that, and it's interesting to see, you know, where it all kind of started and like what it's at now. Even though that's not really an action game, it's more atmospheric, it's still interesting that multiplayer games in that style kind of moved on, especially with like Dying Light too. I mean, Dying Light was really interesting to me, and I actually had a lot of fun with it. But like everything else, it's just another zombie game that's not totally scary.
Yeah. I think the evolution of the horror games and like with the multiplayer aspects put into it, like you even see things like, you know, like Call of Duty Zombie Horde now, right? Where it's not horror anymore. It's just, it has that stamp of horror, and it almost feels like it's a way to get to allow gratuitous amounts of gore in your games. Like if you just classify it as a horror game, and like it is kind of fun. Like I actually am enjoying some of the newer, I guess like actiony horror games, things that more like Deceit and stuff like that, where
even Prey,
right?
Like the newer Prey.
Prey was great because it had that spook factor, right? Where like anything could jump out at you and just be there. Like I was mentioning with Deceit, the whole idea of like the social deduction with it as well. Or Evolve even had that too, which, I mean, Evolve wasn't a great game, but the multiplayer was at least somewhat interesting in the way where you didn't know what the bad guy was, right? And I think that's more interesting than seeing a massive horde of zombies running at you. Like, it's someone in your party, and you're trying to deal with like the shit that's going on too at the same time, right? So like those kind of games, and seeing the evolution of the action towards that that direction is interesting, and it does feel like it's paying more of a homage back to more of like classic horror games, opposed to, you know, some of the like the Resident Evil 6s in the world, where it's like, what is this? What am I playing?
And another thing too, and I mean, it's another zombie game, but I feel it really got, I don't want to say slept on, because a lot of people hated on it because it wasn't up to expectations. But I beat it recently, and I think Days Gone is actually really interesting, at least on like the zombie side of things, right? Because the open world, it's a big world. You know, you get to drive around. The main character's kind of boring, but the hordes that you fight, it's, you know, that sense of fear. I was like, whoa, like I haven't really felt that in a game in a long time, especially a game of that style. And it made me think, I'm like, what if you made like a Silent Hill or just something in that realm, like a more atmospheric, but an open world setting like that. Like, take away like the linear paths and the, you know, different stages and just made it open world, scary. It'd be cool. You know, like I would love to see that system in a more traditional, old school kind of like horror game.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it sounds like we're kind of like, I guess, like bashing the genre almost to a certain extent. Like the way that it evolved and changed over the years is kind of, it's unfortunate, right? Where we kind of lose a lot of that more psychological horror. Like I still remember playing Resident Evil 2 and just being terrified of the sewers and just that whole stage and like the walking past the same area multiple times. And then at one point the gator jumps out at you, right? Like, and like that's a terrifying moment in an action horror game. And it is sad to see that like the way things evolved and changed over the years, to be less focused on horror and more just on running and gunning through things. But I mean, like you can't really fault those games as well because they were just chasing a trend. Like they were chasing what was popular. And like Resident Evil 4 really revolutionized the game, not just for horror games, but for all action games after it. It was like when you look at the way that the camera even was set up in Resident Evil 4 compared to other third person view games at that time, or third person action games, like the camera was independent of the character for most of those games. So it was really hard to get your boundaries a lot. And it was because you're not only controlling where your character's facing, now you're controlling where the camera's facing as well. And it almost felt like shaky cam at all times. And playing a game for 30 hours of shaky cam, like that's a lot. And like I wouldn't be surprised at all if people got kind of motion sickness from that. And it made it really hard to make like an action game that was compelling in that sense. So Resident Evil 4, with making the camera like, you know, stuck in one place right behind the character, was really revolutionary in that front. And then you start seeing that in not just horror games, but all third person action games or just games in general, survival, all of it. So like that idea of the camera placement was really revolutionary. And then in 4, we have like the first time, like, yes, this idea got overplayed and it's almost like kind of like cringy or like groan factor now, but the active time button presses.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Like that 4 was one of the first games to really push that out there, but they did it in a way that it wasn't like too much, I would say, but it added to the scene itself because it was so fresh and new. And then you see games like God of War and whatnot, like kind of take that, run with it, and start putting it in ways where it's like, this is stupid. Like it just became like flooded in the games market, and it just was a little too much. But if you think about it, like that really set the stage for a lot of these games that we consider greats or classics, was the way that Resident Evil 4 kind of just changed the game up a little bit. But it's still,
I mean, look at Last of Us.
Yeah, like it's all there. Like, but that, like, it takes so much from what 4 was able to do, right? Like that game set the groundwork for so many other games after it. And then of course we just oversaturated the market with too much action, too much active time button presses, too much, you know, like just pointless running and gunning through areas, and what's the next big giant gun we can put in there, you know, like it just became too much over the years. And it's nice to see things kind of coming back and seeing a lot of people realizing like, okay, we need to actually tone it down and bring back the horror factor, bring back that psychological idea. And I feel like we're starting to see that, like we started to see that more with like these co-op style horror games where you're throwing in that psychological factor where like, hey, like your buddy is a killer, he's trying to get you, now what are you going to do to stop them, right? Like, and it is a much more interesting concept in that way, which I really enjoy. Like the Dying Light series, right? Like isn't it the Dying Light series with the where you're a killer and then everyone's trying to get you, or you're trying to survive the killer?
There's Dead by Daylight.
Dead by Daylight, that's the one. Yeah. So like Dead by Daylight really like takes that and idea of the psychological aspect of it and runs with it, right? Like it's kind of nice too, but it's also pulling on a lot of like nostalgia strings too, where, you know, they're starting to put in classic killers, like they have Scream Face and all that shit now, which it's like, okay, I get it, right? It's fun. It's a little much, but it's still fun. And I like that they're trying to stay relevant, but like that's one of the ways that the action horror genre has evolved. It went to the over extreme, then it started to kind of come back a little bit, and then now we're seeing like social deception. Like, how do you add in the psychological horror without taking away any of the action? And I think that was their answer to it, was adding in the idea of social deception, because it's as much psychological horror as the players want. So it's based on like how much the players themselves want to inject into the game, opposed to the game designers putting it in themselves, right? So it's kind of like an interesting balance where now you get to decide how scary this game actually is through your actions and the way that the characters are being played themselves. Because like the villains aren't scripted anymore, so it's a different way of looking at it. It's very interesting. So I'm curious to see where that kind of continues to evolve and where we go from there with these more co-op-y kind of horror games. So it's a fun little experiment, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I like playing horror games with another person, even if like they don't actually play with me. It's fun having that experience with somebody. And I think that, you know, it really breathes new life into it, no matter what.
Yeah, agreed. Totally agreed. All right, so before we hop into this week's game, we are going to take a little break here. We're going to hear a word from our sponsors for this episode, and then we are going to hop back in and talk about The Evil Within 2. That's right. A game that you guys might not have thought of, and it's a little older, and it didn't do so great, but I think it's one of those sleeper hits. So we'll be back to talk about that game real shortly.
You find yourself staring down the mouth of a dark cave, hearing the low rumble of something large inside. This is it. Everything you have been fighting for lies just within this cave. Hey man, what's the matter? This is your big ending fight scene.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've just been so tired today. Feels like I've been hit with like 2 points of exhaustion. Ugh.
You know what? I have just this thing to get you back into the adventuring spirit.
Really?
Of course. I have a delicious roast from Geek Grind Coffee.
Huh. That sounds pretty cool. What kind of brews do they have?
They have blends like Dragon's Roast, Dwarven Dawn, Wizard's Mist, and so much more. They have even one celebrating Jim Henson's The Labyrinth, the Goblin King's Elixir.
Whoa, those sound awesome. I'm waking up just hearing about them. Is there an easy way for me to pick up some?
I got you. For the fans of our show, if you visit geekgrindcoffee.com right now and enter the promo code GLITCH at the checkout, you will get 20% off your order.
Whoa, that's great. So you're saying if I go to geekgrindcoffee.com right now and enter the promo code GLITCH at checkout, I'll get 20% off my order? That's amazing.
That's right-yo.
All right, I'm ready for this adventure. Bring it on. Hey, that's a natural 20. Just like the discount you can get when entering the promo code GLITCH at geekgrindcoffee.com.
Level up your morning with Geek Grind Coffee.
All right, we're back, everybody. And like I said, we went over a lot of the history of action horror games, where they went, where and how they're coming back. And now we're going to be diving into the game for this week, which I mentioned earlier is The Evil Within 2. We're not going to be really going into the first one too much because you actually don't need to play the first game to enjoy the second one. And they did that on purpose. The first game did not do very well. It did okay, but it just wasn't enough. Like, a lot of people said that first game it felt outdated when it came out, which is a shame because it's made by the same director who did Resident Evil 4 and like the whole Resident Evil franchise. Like, he's the one who's like created the idea of action horror and survival horror. And his last game that he directed himself, it just kind of didn't do so great. But then he did end up becoming more of a mentor. He took on that role, and now he's mentoring a lot of these newer game directors that are creating some amazing like survival horror games and things like that are coming out. And one of them is The Evil Within 2. And I feel like that game actually did what the first one was trying to do as far as bring back the action horror genre. Now, there are some unfortunate things with the timing of the release of this game because it did come out the same year that Resident Evil 7 came out, which a lot of people will say that is the resurgence of the genre. Like, that is the penultimate version of how to bring back the action and the horror, like how to perfectly meld them in a more modern environment. And, I gotta say, I played The Evil Within 2, and it's a really fun and enjoyable experience. There's a lot of really interesting character designs, a lot of really cool psychological stuff going on there. The action is actually really fun. You do feel a lot of stress throughout it because, of course, with these survival horror games, very limited resources. You gotta, craft and figure things out, but they did a lot of really interesting things with this title that are, I would say, a little different and actually some answers to some problems that other games might have had. One of them, actually, before we go into like the story and more dive into the game itself, was open world games this was like in 2017, we were seeing a lot of open world games just flood the market at that time. And we still are today. But I think one of the big problems with open world games is that sometimes they can feel very empty. Now, The Evil Within 2 does have a slight open world aspect built into it. There's a kind of like hub area, the city that you're roaming around before you get into the more linear kind of stages within the game. And you can actually like free roam around this area and pick up like transmissions to go find weapon caches and stuff like that. There's actually weapons in this game that you can completely miss if you don't go and find these little transmissions around the city. So it did make it more interesting to be able to kind of explore. But what made it interesting and kept it fun to go around in this kind of slightly open world environment was the fact that it was slightly open world. It was more of an enclosed space, but you were able to free roam, right? So they packed a lot, like basically, if you look at like a world like Skyrim, right? Like, you expect to be able to find a lot of stuff because it's a big, wide open world to walk around. Now, if you take the world of Skyrim, the side quests, all the things that you can find, and condense it down into like one or two cities, then you would feel like there's something to do at all times. And they actually paid respect to the Batman Arkham Knights or Arkham City, where it is that kind of like open world feel, but it's not a very big open world. So they were able to kind of like condense everything down and make it feel like there was so much more in this world to do than there actually was. So it was a really nice way of kind of expanding that illusion of open world, and it's a very clever way of answering that problem that we might have with open world games in general. So I would say kudos to, the Evil Within 2 team for, setting that up, because it is a very clever way of doing it. So it was kind of fun. And actually, like during my playthrough with the first time I got into the city, I was able to get one of the strongest weapons in the game, which is the crossbow, which you can actually walk away from. You don't have to get it at all, which I think is kind of funny. But yeah, you can just go around, find all the crazy big weapons right away. Like, you don't have to wait until it gets handed to you, right? Like, let's say you're in Resident Evil 3 and someone hands you a rocket launcher and says, go shoot Nemesis, right? Like, in the game, there's actually, I believe, 2 weapons that are scripted and handed to you. And I think that's the hunting knife and the pistol. After that, it's up to you to actually find the rest of the weapons. Oh, wait, no, it's the pistol and the assault rifle. The assault rifle is given to you very late game. But before that, like, you can totally avoid getting the crossbow. You can avoid getting the shotgun. There's some really interesting stuff there, which I think is kind of funny. And it's a fun way of doing it. Right. So that means the playthrough gets catered to you. Now, when it comes to story, like, it's not the strongest story in the world. I think the best way to put it is it's basically if Freddy Krueger was in the Matrix, right? It's a weird way of setting it up, but I feel like the trailers and everything, all the kind of like verbiage around this game don't actually let you know that you're going into a machine. So all of this is happening in the subconscious. So basically everyone jacks into a machine and they go into the world of STEM. STEM is a program developed by the evil conglomerate business. Of course, there has to be an evil conglomerate company. It's come by Mobius, that's the company itself, and they're trying to create a utopian environment for people to go into and live. They actually want people to live in STEM and become like a collective mind, where there's no war, no fear, no pain. That's kind of their like big spiel, their big speech. But obviously that just means if you go against Mobius or you don't agree with some of the programming, then you just get killed off and no one would be the wiser. So that's kind of the idea behind the Mobius project or the STEM project. So the story is you are, your main character's name is Sebastian Castellones, and you are trying to get your daughter back, which you thought your daughter and your wife died in a fire. It turns out that Mobius, the big bad company from the first one as well, actually took your wife and daughter because your daughter's mind, of course, is the perfect mind to use to create the STEM project. It's the most stable one that they have found. So they kidnap your daughter and basically use her to create this world. Now you're trying to get her back because something is threatening her. So, of course, super cheesy concepts right there. But they did it in kind of an interesting way, I would say. Like, you actually do feel for Sebastian. You feel his heartache as he's going and trying to get his daughter back. He's going through, like, he was a detective in the first one, and now he is more of a down and out alcoholic. He's lost everything, and he's trying now to get it back, right? He's trying to get his life back. And you follow him as he goes through the different stages of basically grief throughout the game. And it's interesting, man. I feel like the character design is really good for the characters they have in it because there's not that many characters actually in this game. You have the main big bad, the owner of Mobius, like he's there. You have your wife, your kid, Sebastian. The kid's name is Lily, by the way. And then you have basically you have the 2 main bosses in the game, and those are really the only main fleshed out characters within this. And that unfortunately is probably due to the kind of sped up production time frame that they had while making this game. They only had 2 years to make this title, which for what they did in 2 years, it's actually very impressive. It is really good. But you feel like you could use some more time in the oven, right? Like this definitely, and you can kind of see it with some of the texturing and things like that, some of those issues. But I think my favorite thing about this game as a whole, the thing that really won me over, the thing that saves this title, in my opinion, is the actual bosses themselves and the fact that they are able to then manipulate the world in STEM and kind of create their warped nightmare utopians, like their own personal utopias, right? And the first villain that you run into, he's actually a wartime photographer that got hurt. And he was out there in the field and a grenade went off next to him. He ended up losing his eye in the process. But at that same time, he took a picture, right? As like in reaction to the explosion. And he captured basically the final breath of the soldier in front of him. And then he became obsessed with capturing that final moment. He considered that like the most beautiful thing he's ever seen, where he captures this person's death. So in his utopian world, you're seeing like some really strange, bizarre art pieces around you. Like one of the things you witness is like these weird time cubes where time kind of repeats, and it's like the same 3 seconds on loop. And it is the moment of people's deaths. So he goes up, stabs them. So you get like the crazy blood spray, and then like it's stuck in that like 3 seconds, the capturing of the final breath. Right. And it's a very clever idea, and the stages are super creepy and super bizarre. And like it's a lot. It's pretty intense, and it leads to some really interesting imagery throughout the stages. And I felt like it was a very clever idea, and a very clever villain to put into this. And I think maybe it was tugging at my heartstrings a little bit because of the artist side in me, but it was just very. It was very fun. And, he did have some throwaway lines that were a little cheesy from an artist perspective, but they were, I feel like they made them kind of cheesy because, not many people are going to know like big name or a lot of artist names off the top of their head. So they kind of had to go a little bit, more with the more well-known artist, I guess.
More mainstream, less hipster.
Yeah. So like he even says like, oh, Picasso had his blue period and I'm having my red period. Right. So like that's the whole idea of him like killing everyone, like, oh, blood, it's the most beautiful thing. So like, it's just like, okay, I get it. That's clever enough, I guess. Right. It's fun. It's interesting. But it was really cool to see that stage kind of work out. But then the next villain that you encounter, then the one that you fight, after that, he's a preacher in the game, in his like utopian world where like he's the main, like he's basically like the Pope or the leader of this church. But it turns out that he was a motivational speaker in the real world. And Mobius hired him because he was able to convince people to move into STEM, to agree to put their consciousness in this, to make it seem like it's a successful business model. And so in his world, he is like a preacher that you're fighting, and they like purify everything with fire. Of course, you fight some crazy, zealots with flamethrowers because they have to add that kind of stuff. But I think the actual interesting, like the big nugget of like, oh, that's actually a really cool idea. And it's kind of fun because it almost acknowledges the issues with the first game and allows you to confront them in this one. Because you basically have a boss rush during this period when you're fighting the motivational speaker, this zealot, this, preacher. And he basically is trying to, psychoanalyze Sebastian, bring up the horrors of his past because he's realizing he's not getting to him through his words. So he wants to use fear instead, and makes him relive the horrors of the first game. So you actually have to go through and fight all the bosses from the first game, at like basically reliving that fear and that torment, that moment where he lost everything, he lost his family and all that. So it's kind of a cool idea and a play on that. Now, the final boss, which I kind of had some problems with because it almost felt a little too much, but I can see where they were going, is actually your wife. Your wife is there trying to save Lily, your daughter, and she was dealing with her grief, and she becomes like this very protected like presence in a way. And anyone who's trying to get to Lily or harm her or do anything like that has to die, basically. And she ends up becoming this crazy morphed, like almost Attack on Titan style beast at one point, the ending of it. But it is pretty interesting where like she just kind of like loses herself. And then, of course, after shooting your wife in the face like 30 times when she's a big ass monster, she comes back and says, you're right. I lost myself. I'm sorry. Go save our daughter, Lily, and get us out of here. Right. So there's the ending isn't as strong, I feel, as the first two stages or the first two bosses. And once again, I think that has to do with the fact that it was put on very like 2 years is not a long time to develop these characters out fully or to develop these scenes fully. But the visuals themselves are very interesting. You go from the first one, which is very dark, very surreal. Like you have a lot of plays with like picture frames and weird drapery and just really interesting colors. Then the second area is like all fire and brimstone and like classic, like old cathedral style things. And then the last stage with your wife is more empty and kind of like a snowy landscape, which actually could be the idea of maybe everything's covered in ash since they were said to have burned up in a fire. But everything is like covered in white, which is different from what you would expect from a typical horror game and different from all the previous stages that you just went through. Everything was so dark, and then now everything is so white and bright and you can see everything around you, but it still has that kind of slight creep factor to it. But I don't know. Like I feel like the story itself, like the first two villains, really kind of like kept me interested in the game for a long time, and then it just kind of it kind of fell out because the whole Matrix idea thing was just like the whole dystopia idea is like played out. I'm like, okay, I get it, right? But I feel like they did a really good job with this game, and it was really fun to play through this one. And it is very like some of the designs of those characters and those villains. It's like, oh man, that's a lot. It's intense. And then being like adding in the extra stress of having to monitor your bullet counts and all that. Like they did a really good job with it, in my opinion. And there is the RPG element as well, where you can level up your character and make him stronger by collecting green goop from enemies and weird shit like that. But I think that they did a very good job with the time constraints they had. I just feel like it was unfortunate timing when it did come out, because Resident Evil 7, right? Who's going to pass that up? So it's tough, but I don't know. Like, what's your overall take on this? Like, how do you feel The Evil Within did? I know I kind of stole it for a bit, went off on a long tangent.
No, that's totally fine because I played the first one. That's honestly my experience with the franchise. I was always interested in 2, and I own 2. I just never got around to it because when it came out, I remember people talking about it, and then as soon as 7 came out, you didn't really hear it, and it's a shame because, especially the way you describe it, it actually looks and sounds really cool,
right,
and different, and it's a shame because Resident Evil 7's fun. Like I'm playing through it right now and I'm enjoying it. It's they're different. In a sense, like for me, a first-person horror, it's different than the over-the-shoulder kind, like Evil Within. And I personally enjoy the over-the-shoulder look to it. To me, it's scarier because then you actually can see if there's anything behind you. But I think the idea, even with the kind of cheesy story, I still think it's an interesting atmosphere, and I didn't realize like half that stuff that you described would actually be in that game because, the game's not really talked about. Like even on like horror game lists, like no one really, they mention the first game, but you never really hear them mention the second game, and it's kind of sad that it got swept under because horror games aren't always talked about either because it's a niche genre. But I think after hearing you describe it, I really want to like try it out and see because it looks cool.
Yeah. I think it's another thing, and we've mentioned this before in our previous episodes on, the dark ages of gaming and how systems failed, but then they tried to come back and say like, hey, don't worry about it, we fixed it, try out this one. I feel like people got burned by the first game and didn't want to give the second one a chance, which is a true shame. Like the first one had paid such a homage to the whole like Saw style of media, where the second one went more back to like the psychological horror, and I think they did it very well. And it's a shame, and I think it's one of those kind of like sleeper hits that like when people play it, they're like, oh, this actually was pretty damn good. And it's unfortunate that they're probably never going to make a Evil Within 3, and that's why we don't see one or any DLC for that matter for this game, because it just didn't do great. But it is one of those games that I feel like it's actually a very interesting like way to come back to the action horror game, because Resident Evil 7 was great and it does that where it comes back to the action horror, but it is still very kind of like linear in that aspect. This is more of like, I feel like it's a kind of more of a successor to Resident Evil 4. What that game was able to do, I feel like that's what they were trying to continue with the Evil Within 2. And it's a shame that this one came out after the first one, because no one's going to really play it, which sucks. But there's some good news. If you do have Xbox Game Pass, which I feel like we keep bringing up, but I want people to to understand that like we're not sponsored by them or anything like that, but there's ways to like interact and play these games that you might have passed up on or not heard of. So like Alien Isolation, the game we talked about last week, and now this one, Evil Within 2, even the Evil Within 1 are on Xbox Game Pass available for you to play right now. So you can experience those games for theoretically free, right? Like if you're paying for Xbox Game Pass. But they're like, it's nice to see that they're keeping those games alive in a sense with this with Game Pass. So it's kind of cool that that's there. And I like to be able to let you guys know, the listeners and the players out there, like where you can access these games easily, where you're not paying $60 just to try them out. So you can, experience them for yourselves. So like I said, if you have Xbox Game Pass, go check it out. It is an enjoyable experience. Don't go in there expecting like a holy shit amazing game, but I feel like that happens a lot with like movies as well too, right? Where some people will say like, oh, this movie is garbage, it's horrible, so you pass up on it, and then you watch it maybe a couple years later, and you're like, you know what, that movie was fun. That was a decent movie, but it just didn't live up to the hype and the expectations during the time, so it gets brushed under the rug, which is an unfortunate thing. But it happens all the time across all media. So I don't know. I would say give it a chance, because it does do some very interesting things. That's for sure.
And if you don't have Game Pass, the cool thing about this series is it's inexpensive compared to a lot of other horror games on consoles. Mm-hmm. Like Evil Within 2, it really doesn't seem like it goes over $15 anymore.
Which is not bad at all. For $15, you're going to have a really fun time with this game.
The first one, it's weird. It looks like for the PlayStation 4, it randomly is $40, which is interesting, used. But I mean, $10 or so for Evil Within 2, it's not a bad deal. Horror games nowadays are always worth a lot of money. And I mean, as the generations go on, these horror games are going to be harder to find, probably harder to play, unless Game Pass, keeps them forever, which who knows if they will. But, with horror games, I feel like they're always worth playing because they're only going to get rarer,
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us this week. I hope you guys enjoyed our dive into more horror games, the action side of horror, and our continuation on Spooky Month itself. So yeah, thank you guys so much for listening in this week. We hope to talk to you guys next week as we dive into some more games and check out some more titles out there. Maybe shed some light on some more titles that you've never even heard of or have passed up on in the past.
Hidden gems
of gaming. All right. Thank you guys so much. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. If you want to reach out to us on the social medias, you know where to find us. There's links in our descriptions to our link tree where you can find us on all of those different platforms. And just thank y'all. We'll talk to you guys next week. All right. And bye.
Bye.